I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Professor Sarah Griswold, Assistant Professor of European History, specifically of modern France, at Oklahoma State University, and I find out the moving force behind the I-35 Francophiles. A 2018 graduate of NYU's Joint Doctoral Program in French Studies and History, her research explores the history of ideas, institutions, and policies focused on cultural heritage in the modern era. Her first book, Resurrect the Past, France's Forgotten Heritage, Mandate in the Middle East, is under contract with Cornell University Press and examines ideas, policies, and politics that emerged out of the French Mandatory Antiquities Service for Syria and Lebanon. She has published in Journal of the History of Collections, Journal of Levantine Studies, Future Anterior, Journal of Historic Preservation, and War and Society, all premier journals. At Oklahoma State University, she teaches courses on the history of modern Europe, French Empire, era of world wars, and the politics of commemoration and memory. She's on the governing council of the Western Society for French History and lead organizer for the Society's Bridges Project, aimed at supporting diverse career trajectories after the PhD. Amen. Sarah's happy to be back on the OU campus, where she spent many happy years popping into her dad's office, former chair of OU history, Rob Griswold, as well as her freshman year of college. So, without further ado, with great pleasure, Professor Sarah Griswold.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Alan, for inviting me and for the introduction. Thank you, Trice, for taking care of the logistics, and to the Schusterman Center for putting on, a great series that I wish I could come to more often, but sadly teach at OSU and live in Tulsa, so that would be a bit of a trek. But I'd also like to thank everyone for coming. I know a lot of you. I know my parents who are obviously who are here, and I've known a lot of you since I was a kid, so it's nice to see you and to share my work today. You might notice that the title is slightly different than what was advertised, a hazard of telling Alan what I was going to work on months ago and then doing more of the research for it and realizing I wanted to slightly talk about something very related, but a bit different. Mainly, I'm not going to talk about the culture of collection, but I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A about, for example, what's the Louvre collected, which is the main museum in France that is the kind of repository for artifacts found during biblical archaeological digs. So, without further ado, I will show you kind of what the main questions are for today's talk, which also provide an organizing structure for the talk. It should fall roughly into two parts. One a bit uneven. The first part will probably be a little bit shorter. But the first question is, what was the relationship of French archaeologists to biblical archaeology in the 20th century, especially when the subfield was surging in the period after 1918? And so there's different periodizations that you could use to trace the history of biblical archaeology. Certain excavations began in the 19th century that had a kind of biblical questions rooting them. But I find after 19 really interesting, particularly because that's what my book is about, which was the period of mandatory rule in Palestine, Iraq, and French mandate Syria and Lebanon. And then the second question is, what or who helps explain a resurgent, arguably novel passion for both biblical studies and biblical archaeology in contemporary France? And so what I'm going to be tracing is essentially what I call in French a froideur, so kind of a coolness to biblical archaeology comparatively when you look at French archaeology compared to example, British or Israeli or to American real passion for biblical archaeology, we don't really see the same level of commitment and intensity in the French case. But I'm finding a really interesting kind of resurgence right now. And I'm going to focus on one man in particular to kind of anchor that part of the talk around. And so I should also say, and this is one chapter of 6. Like I have one chapter really on biblical archaeology, so I have one chapter of 6, and so I'm not a biblical archaeologist. I'm not even an archaeologist. And so some of this, I've learned along the way too. But I want to, I have this point of reference, and it's in small print for those in the back. Biblical archaeology, while technically applying to both the Hebrew Bible and to the Christian New Testament, has most commonly focused on questions related to the Hebrew Bible, so to the Christian Old Testament. And that is partly because it's a longer time period. It is a broader geographic coverage. There are more structures that remain, substructures to excavate. And that's going to be the case in the French cases I'll talk about today. So most of French biblical archaeology has also focused on questions that relate to the Hebrew Bible, not, for example, to, can you find, the tomb of Jesus Christ? All right. So, historiographical trends. This is something I'm going to be kind of light on. So, in general, when one hears biblical archaeology in terms of who's written about it in terms of who's historicized it, and I think even arguably when you think about what countries have been leaders in the subfield of biblical archaeology, it's not often the French who are associated with that subfield of the discipline's history, of archaeology's history. And that's despite some important figures, which is interesting. So I'm going to talk about one in this first part of the talk named André Perrault. But there's others who precede him. I don't have their names listed, but Charles Clermont-Ganneau, for example, who was in the diplomatic corps posted to Jerusalem in the 1860s, is credited with finding and helping interpret the Moabite stone, which was discovered in 1868, and then he worked on it in the 1870s. Raymond Weil, who's one of the only French Jewish archaeologists whom I've been able to find in my research, who worked on the Ophel Hill in Jerusalem in the 1910s. And then, of course, we have the Catholics, an interesting whole other story that I can talk about, named with one key figure being Roland de Vaux, who worked for the French state-funded École biblique et archéologique française de Jerusalem, so the French School of Biblical Archaeology, and who famously worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there are people who, French, primarily men, who've been studied throughout this subdiscipline. But by and large, most of the historiographical work has not focused on them. And so here I have a kind of array of titles. Eric Klein, an American, has written multiple books. If you're interested, he wrote the Oxford Short Introduction to the History of Biblical Archaeology. But I have his book called Digging Up Armageddon there on the left. Bruce Cooklick at Penn, who wrote Puritans of Babylon, about American excavations in Sumer in the 19th century. Eitan Bar Yosef's The Holy Land in English Culture, which looks at British imaginings, but also to a certain extent biblical archaeology in Palestine in the 19th century. Billy Melman, who's at Tel Aviv University, I believe, or Haifa, I can't remember. But she is an expert on British history and wrote a great new book that came out in 2020 called Empires of Antiquities, that looks at archaeology, much of it interested in what she calls biblical modes and biblical questions in Mandatory Palestine, Iraq, and then in Egypt. And then we have Neil Silberman, who's worked on history interests among various Middle Eastern countries, in archaeology in the 20th century. And he's written a lot of newspaper articles and kind of long-form journalism on Israeli interest in archaeology and the kind of politics of that. And then lastly, Finding Jerusalem, which again looks at kind of Israeli interest in archaeology. So what I found interesting as I started doing my book research was this strand, this through line of French archaeologists who were working on biblical questions or, doing biblical archaeology. Sometimes they would talk about it openly, but most often they referred to themselves as Near East, ancient archaeologists of the ancient Near East. And so one of the key figures in my book is named René JuSt. René JuSt was a leading luminary of the time from really the 1910 to the 1950s, 1960s. And so this is his business card, which I found, it's in the archives in France. And you can see the titles that he has. He was a member of the Institut de France, which is one of the key academic institutes in France. He was the curator of Near Eastern antiquities at the Louvre. And he was a professor at the École du Louvre, which taught curators and archaeologists from the 1880s up to the present. But what I found really interesting with these archives that I'm going to show you, and here's a picture of him working on his study. This is a 2-page document. Actually, it's about 10 pages, but I'm going to show you 2 pages. So this is the kind of cover sheet, and it's from the French Diplomatic Archives, specifically the French Diplomatic Archives Cultural Diplomacy Office. And I found it in summer of 2012. It was actually the document that got me really interested in my project. So it's kind of one of those, foundational documents. And it was a confidential memo. You can see it's actually not signed, but it's written confidential in the upper left-hand corner in his hand, which I am happy to say I struggled with and finally can decipher. I can read anything he writes, but it took a lot of reading. This is a confidential memo that he prepared for the French Foreign Ministry. And because of his stature in Paris, he is actually, from my analysis, the leader on the ground in France of everything the French are doing in the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. So the French take over Syria and Lebanon. I'll date it from 1918, a little bit kind of fuzzy, but 1918. They set up an antiquities service in 1920 that is for the mandate, but the French are really in control. But JuSt's never there. He's always in Paris, but he does get to call a lot of the shots about where they did. And what he's responding to in this document is the French Foreign Ministry panicking, essentially, that the Americans and the British, with their deeper pockets, are getting all the good stuff, especially in Palestine. And so JuSt is saying, right here, it's in French, and I should have written it for you in translation. I'm not going to translate the whole thing. But it says, he's saying Palestine, and he says, in Palestine, the Americans and the British are sharing 11 excavation sites. And he notes how much money they're spending. And then he has this really interesting passage. And he says, there's no point in us appearing on Palestinian territory where one can say, or where we might say, the Americans and the British, led by biblical zeal, are working at a loss. So he says, they're motivated by what he literally calls biblical zeal, specifically at Megiddo, which was the biblical, considered to be the biblical Armageddon. That's what they were hoping to find. And so he discourages it and says, we can do enough in Syria and Lebanon. So I thought, okay, that's interesting. I found that one in 2012. I also started to see, again, this is all kind of from my research for my book on the French Mandate. I saw that JuSt's protege, a man named André Perrault, was nevertheless doing both ancient Near Eastern archaeology, but arguably also describing himself, I mean, literally as a biblical archaeologist. And if you read his own writing, it's clear that to a certain extent he's motivated by biblical zeal. So I'll kind of give a quick overview of what he does. So his archaeological career is really anchored in this era of the mandates. He goes to British mandate in Palestine in 1926, where he's basically a postdoctoral student. He stays for a year, and he does research at the French École Biblique, so the biblical school, which is run by Dominicans. But by that time, by the 1920s, it's partially funded by the French state, which is interesting. He goes to British mandate Iraq, and then does a dig. And because he does a good job, he's given his own dig at ancient Mari. You can see that the years that the kind of flourishing of ancient Mari matches up with some of the kind of history told in the Hebrew Bible. And so he's really interested in finding biblical sites from he's a Protestant pastor, so for him, from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. So I found some interesting stuff that he does. In 1932, he self-publishes a small book called From Jericho to Babylon, Does Contemporary Archaeology Confirm the Bible? He answers in the affirmative, which is interesting. He's pretty exceptional among French archaeologists at the time and doing things like that. And then he goes on to publish multiple books in a series called Bible and Archaeology from 1952. Some of the titles, for example, are Noah's Ark, The Tower of Babel, Nineveh. And in that first book to launch that series called Bible Archaeology, he says that the believer has nothing to fear from the excavation. Essentially, what we will find will confirm, not necessarily dispute or question what you find in your faith or what you've been told in your faith. Oops, I'm sorry. So, in my reading, having looked at a lot of these documents, like JuSt's confidential memo describing biblical zeal at work motivating the British and the Americans, and Andre Perot's own arguably reticence about really claiming the mantle of being a biblical archaeologist. I should say a lot of those books that he publishes are published in Switzerland. They're published in French. He publishes them with a Swiss press, which leads me to think that he didn't think that he would find a French audience. His books sell better in their English translations than they do in the French, in the original French. I think that there's clearly a tension in France where certain certain influential intellectuals, people of real esteem and standing, so JuSt, Perot becomes the director of the Louvre in 1968, believe in a place for biblical archaeology and biblical culture in French culture and French education, and yet are worried that they will be rebuffed. So I'm going to briefly kind of hypothesize about the reasons for this froidure, and then introduce why I think there's an interesting thaw underway that I think has implications for both French Christians, secularists, French Jews, and I'll also talk about how this has application in Israel. And I'm going to use kind of one guy to trace that. So explaining the froidure. So I have my colleague Jennifer Davis, who's part of the I-35 Frenchies reading group that we do once a month. And so some of what I'm going to say, I think, it will be unsurprising, but I would imagine there's a lot of non-French historians in the audience. So this is kind of for you, this potted history of French skepticism towards biblical archaeology. So I think that there's deep and multiple strands for kind of tracing this froidure towards biblical archaeology in France, why we don't see the same level of open investment, open claiming the mantle as we do in Britain, America, and then, of course, Israel. So one is the Catholic strand, which I'm not going to talk about much right now, but I'm happy to do so in Q&A, which feared in the mid-19th century into the late 19th century that historicizing or investigating the archaeological subsoil implied a questioning of the scripture, or would in fact possibly contradict what the Bible said, and thereby weaken believers' faith. So that was, in a nutshell, the main Catholic concern about what was initially biblical criticism and then also biblical archaeology. I think another obvious place to start, though, for why there's a foi dire about biblical archaeology is with the modern institutionalization in France of state secularism, which I'm going to kind of be reductive here, but can be most simplistically easily dated to 1905, which is when the French Third Republic passed a suite of laws from 1901 to 1905 aimed at severing religion from the public sphere, notably from government, but also crucially from educational instruction, which made it against the law to teach religion as a matter of faith in public schools. So you could theoretically still teach, for example, about Buddhism the history of the religion, what the religion practiced, likewise Judaism, likewise Christianity, but you weren't supposed to proselytize, right? But in practice, many public schools just dropped religious education because there was a fear of being hauled in for, breaking the new law. The history of secularization in France since 1905 hasn't been linear. So, for example, in 1920, the French far right pushed through the canonization of Joan of Arc by the Vatican. And in 1920, the French Parliament decreed a yearly national festival to be held in her honor. But by and large, particularly as French church-going practices dwindled in the 1960s and on, with Catholicism being the major religion in France, the country gradually became known as and really self-styled as a secular country. And that was a label perversely reinforced in the post-World War II period, when deserved national shame for having deported an estimated 76,000 members of the Jewish community living in France to Nazi extermination camps in the Holocaust led French lawmakers to ban the collection of racial or religious data in France, the objective being to make the point that you were French regardless of your creed. Critics have, of course, argued that marginalizing religion like that both from the public sphere and from personal identification has led to the curtailment of individual rights, a situation that both the Jewish and the Muslim communities in France have challenged and disputed, notably among the latter community with the 2004 French law banning the wearing of religious symbols in public schools, sometimes referred colloquially as the headscarf ban, meaning the Islamic hijab. But I think there's a change underway for biblical archaeology, for biblical studies specifically, that I'm calling a thaw. So I'm going to turn to that now. And like I said, I'm going to actually focus on one person, which I always tell my students at OSU that we should avoid practicing great person history, great man history, but I'm going to be guilty of it a bit myself today, because as I did the research for this talk, I just became really fascinated by this one person and the kind of power that he wields in France today. I mean, at least that's part of my kind of argument, my thesis today. So the coming of Thomas Romer. So to the Collège de France, right? So Thomas Romer, who is he? He is the administrator and president of professors, meaning that he is the director of the esteemed Collège de France, which is seated in Paris in the Latin Quarter, the picture of it here. He was elected by his peers to lead the organization, to be the head in 2019. He had given he'd come on board, elected to his chair in 2007. And I'll explain kind of what this chairship means in a minute. And then he gave his inaugural lecture in 2009, which is a kind of coming of, a rite of passage for these esteemed professors to give their inaugural lecture. And then in 10 years, he's elected as the head of the college. So it's a pretty meteoric rise to the top of the food chain. So a little bit about the collège, because what I'm trying to do is establish like how important he is, right? So the Collège de France is 494 years old, having been founded by King Francis I, François Ier, and is considered among the, if not the most prestigious research establishment in France. The aim of the college was at its foundation and remains to promote and facilitate humanistic and scientific research. And also, crucially, to reach the grand public, the public at large. And so professors are required to do a public lecture every year. They pick one topic within their field, and then they give a series of lectures about it. Professor Romers are every Thursday at 2 p.m. And the grand public can come. Of course, the grand public is going to mean people who live in Paris. Probably, I actually found some interesting anecdotal data about who comes. But there is also an option to watch online. And so they've been, especially since COVID, trying to reach a broader audience. So a little bit more about the collège. It's a select group. At this point, there are 50 professors. They are elected by the professors themselves. And they're required to give these courses. Past faculty include Roland Barthes, the literary theorist, Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, Jean-François Champollion, who deciphered hieroglyphs. A lot of men. There's not many women. And also, they are, for the most part, French. So when Romer took over, he gave his inaugural lecture, and he was introduced by Pierre Corval, who was at the time the head of the collège, so the post that Romer has now. And I want you just to take a look, and this is kind of now it's going to bear a bit on why I think I was invited today to Judaic and Israeli studies lunch. Dear Thomas Romer, Hebrew and Greek were among the first disciplines taught at the collège, thus enabling scholars to understand and interpret the two languages in which the sacred texts were written. Since then, archaeology and ancient languages and religions of the ancient Near East have been given pride of place in our institution, but you offer a radically new perspective by choosing as the title of your chair, right? So they each have a chair, and they get to choose their own what they want to be called. You chose as your chair the Hebrew Bible and its context. You put the Bible at the center of your teaching, which is incidentally a first in the history of the collège. Sorry. So in French, Romer titled his chair Milieu Biblique, so the Bible and environment, which I'm not sure who got to decide this, if it was he or not, but translated in any kind of English document that the college produces, and in the interviews that he's given to the Hebrew Bible in its context. I want to tell you a little bit more about Romer, which makes him interesting. He's not French. He was born in Mannheim in West Germany, taught for most of his career at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. He holds Swiss and German citizenship. It makes him singular. In 2019, when he became the head of the collège, he was the first foreign citizen ever to assume the position since the college's creation. He's also Protestant, which is by far a minority religion in France, although not necessarily uncommon in government and in education and the press. And I relate all these kind of firsts and singularities because, as his introducer mentioned, he is the first also to hold this chair. So at Wilbur's lecture, and this is him giving his inaugural lecture, that is a sculpture of Moses behind him, on February 5th, 2009, he also recognized this kind of first. He says, unless I'm mistaken, the chair you've entrusted me to is the first in which Bible appears explicitly in the title. Why is this so? Is this avoidance of the word Bible to be explained by the idea that scientists can study Hebrew, Aramaic, epigraphy, Semitic antiquities, but that the Bible and its understandings are reserved for synagogues and churches? And then he makes this argument, which I'm going to return to at the end, that the Hebrew Bible is one of the great founding documents of the so-called Judeo-Christian civilization, and at least of Western civilization. It's also a key element for grasping the birth of Islam and the Muslim civilization. Romer is very well respected. I mean, I guess you don't get to be a Collège de France professor if you don't publish a lot. And so he has published more than 350 scholarly publications, including 25 monographs, which I don't know how one ever does that. I think some of his monographs are co-authored. So I'll mention one. This is the person I'm going to return to in a minute. It's Finkelstein, with whom he wrote in French, The Origins of the Torah, that came out in 2019. I'm going to mention how they've combined on an archaeological project here as I kind of transition to that. Romer also has a real vulgarizing or a desire to share research with the public. And so you can see that he's written numerous texts, and you can even just tell from the visual imagery that some of these books are clearly meant for a large grand public. So this says the 100 Words of the Bible. It is part of a series where, it's the 100 words of the French Revolution, the 100 words of the old regime, 100 words of the Bible. This is a book that he wrote, the Old Testament commentated in Exodus for children. And I also want to make the point that Thomas Romer got a lot of French press from the beginning. So this says Thomas Romer, or the popularity of the Bible is à la mode, right? And so this specific interview or kind of coverage comes a year after he gave his first inaugural lecture. And you can see, I've translated some of the text. It says, crowds squeeze into his courses at the Collège de France every Thursday at 2. Some come an hour before to be sure of getting seats. Others will stand for the hour-long lecture. And I noticed that I was like, well, how many people fit into this lecture? I mean, come on, it's like 500-person lecture. So he's got a public audience. The press is really interested. And this is going to become even more so, a lot more press about him when he turns to archaeology, right? So he, throughout his career, described himself as an archaeologist of the text. He starts in the kind of 2010s to get interested in what he says, I realized the need to account for the materiality of the biblical stories. And so I'm just like quoting from him, dialogue between archaeologists and biblical scholars on which I rely is necessary. And so he gradually, and I would really be interested in kind of knowing how this came to be. I read that he ran into Israel Finkelstein at a few conferences, and so it could just be that they liked each other and had similar interests, and that's how he found his way to working alongside Israel Finkelstein. But I will just say something briefly about Israel Finkelstein for people who this is, an unfamiliar character. He is one of the most respected archaeologists, Israeli archaeologists working today. For many years, he was at the Tel Aviv University as the head of the Archaeology Institute, the Institute of the Archaeology of Israel, and he has the title of Professor Emeritus of the Archaeology of Israel from Tel Aviv University. I don't know why, but he's moved university, so he's currently the head of the School of Archaeology at University of Haifa. I'm going to make sure I'm not skipping anything. Okay. So in 2017, from 2017 to 2019, these two forged a joint project. They were the co-leaders for Tel Aviv University and the Collège de France. From what I can tell, it's the first time that the Collège de France had ever sponsored an archaeological excavation in the modern Middle East or in modern Israel. So those two served as the co-directors of the excavation. I want to just briefly show you, for those of you who might know Israel, might know Jerusalem. This is where it's located. So it's about 8 miles northwest of Jerusalem, right on the highway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And the excavation is at Kiryat Yarim. And I'll talk a little bit about what they're looking for. So there's a lot of press about this excavation. I could show you so many news articles about it, but I kind of at some point had to peel back and had 40 slides of really splashy news coverage. But you can see by some of the few that I retained how excited different news publications were from multiple countries. You can see archaeologists to break ground at biblical site where the Ark of the Covenant stood. Very declarative. And I'm going to show you so that we can hopefully hear. I'm guessing that the sound is probably set up to work on a video. We'll find out. If it isn't, that's okay. We don't, I mean, it does have titles. But there was a series of, of the excavation. They did a YouTube channel where they put out very professionally done, but I thought this way you can hear from Romer and Finkelstein themselves. Okay, so there's majestic music playing. They're walking on the site. Interestingly, they had to convince a nunnery to let them dig, which Finkelstein thanked Romer and said we wouldn't have been able to do this without Romer. It's a French nunnery called the Convent of the Ark of the Covenant. Okay. Okay, so sorry, I should have checked the audio beforehand. Hopefully you can kind of get a sense of, it's obviously a longer video. I just put the part of Romer kind of explaining why he thinks this site is interesting, what the implications could be of the find. People got more excited in fall of 2018. So this is 1 year after the excavation had begun, when the team published their preliminary report. And what they reported was that they'd found a massive man-made platform that the team reconstructed and extrapolated would have been about 150 by 110 meters, covering about 1.65 hectares. Here you can see, the excavation in sight, in progress. It attracted media attention. Here we have the Times of Israel. It also, this is again the Times of Israel, but published, translated into French for a French reading audience. I don't know this. I would be interested, maybe people from the audience will know, if this would be targeted more at Francophone Jews living in Israel, or for people living in France who are, interested in subscribing to the Times of Israel, so presumably Jewish, but I don't know for sure. So you can see the kind of feverish interest. The French press kind of jumps on that bandwagon, I think partly because that's in 2018 that news comes out. And a lot of the news coverage kind of is very declarative and says, like, they think they found the Ark of the Covenant. If you read the news coverage a bit more, it's more complex, and the archaeologists are clear about that. They think they found a sanctuary that was built to honor the legend of the Ark that didn't necessarily hold the Ark itself. But it's a bit complicated because sometimes Romer gives interviews where he says, like, it's possible that the Ark was here for 200 years. So I find that kind of slippage interesting. But so he's named the head of the Collège de France in 2019, and then his public prestige really skyrockets. Also because, and here I thought this is interesting, so Thomas Romer, Indiana Jones at the head of the Collège de France. And that really gets reinforced because in 2021, the huge kind of documentary maker in Europe, headquartered in France, Arte, which is kind of like a PBS, but they have better funding, and they focus on cultural and kind of history questions. They come out with a documentary about the exhibition, about the excavation. And this is going to lead to tons of press. So I'll just show you, I'll kind of skip through this, but this is a trailer for the Arte documentary. And the documentary starts showing from January 2nd through March 2021 on the French TV station, Arte. I'm sorry, on French public TV, and it's produced by Arte. And it's called The Ark of the Covenant, The Origins of the Bible. And I'll just show you some of the press reports. So this is Le Monde, which is like, I think, France, kind of the New York Times of France, right? On the trail of the Ark of the Covenant, mythical container that disappeared. Here we've got, this is a magazine that focuses on science, excavations in Israel, Ark loss, great mysteries of the Bible, the real and the legendary. You can see both Romer and Finkelstein there with the golden Ark in the middle, which I think is possibly the same image used in the Indiana Jones movie. We have Telerama, which is a magazine that focuses on TV, and I've just translated it. The archaeologist Israel Finkelstein and the biblist Thomas Romer achieve what every child dreams of after Indiana Jones, finding the Ark of the Covenant. So it's weird that says they achieve it. They found it. But here there are no Nazis or cult ceremonies, only the hill at Kiryat Yearim. The Nouvelle Observateur, which is a pretty usually straightforward newspaper, quite progressive, which I think usually is careful about being sober in its journalistic coverage. You can say, Ark of the Covenant, Origins of the Bible, religious thriller. What happened to the Ark of the Covenant? Did it really exist? For the first time, a team explored the only biblical site never having been excavated in the Jerusalem area. The beginning of the answers and new leads in this captivating investigation. Okay, I realize that I only have about 10 minutes, so I think I'm going to have to stop. I will just briefly kind of indicate some of the questions that I have after doing this research. One is Romer right about the diagnosis of his public success? He says, especially in France, I think that interest in the Bible is a bit of what he says, a return of the oppressed because of secularism. He says, the interest is there. My courses are full. He also, the interviewer kind of interpreted this for him. that the attendance owes to the zeitgeist, a zeitgeist in which a profound return to the founding text joins a quest for meaning in the absence of major ideologies and mobilizing themes. I'm happy to share my slides with anybody who's interested, since I'm going to have to go through these so quickly. But I found kind of three interesting quotes where he identifies what he thinks are the socio-political implications of his work. He says, you have to know the Bible. It's the foundation of our culture. You have to know it to understand history, institutions, and laws. If we ignore the Bible, we deprive ourselves of a tool to understand our current situation. Second, this is really a quote, an argument for his work that is targeted at, I think, France's pattern of terrorist attacks since 2015, carried out predominantly by, as he says, young Islamists. So we had in 2015 an attack at a kosher supermarket in January 2015 in which 19 Jewish shoppers were taken hostage and 4 died. And then again in fall of 2015 when over 150 people were killed in France, again by young men associated to ISIS. And then his last kind of implication of his work, and I think this is interesting for the kind of import that his work possibly has in the Middle East, is he says, I can't help but by writing give a look at the world. I'm interested in biblical figures and the idea of Holy Land. When I hear about the promise of the land made to Israel, I cannot fail to recall that in the biblical text, this promise is formulated to all of Abraham's descendants, not only to the people of Israel. My books are certainly not militant. It's equally impossible for me to disregard my own political or philosophical convictions. So I thought that was interesting. Is he starting to put his neck out into kind of more political debates? And so I will skip my question about Romer and the Grand Public in France by way of conclusion. I will say that I'm going to be looking to see to what extent Romer tries to get involved in the debate right now over teaching what are called the faits religieux, so religious facts in French education. And then third, I'm interested in the kind of relationship that he is pursuing with the French Jewish community. I have to say I did not find almost anything online, so not necessarily the best research tool, but I looked, and the only thing I could find is that he's taken part in a couple of debates with the rabbi of Neuilly, which is a big suburb to the west of Paris. Debates or conversations on France's, what it's called, France's largest digital Jewish campus. So it's kind of an online, called Academ, or online, I think, kind of university on Jewish topics for the Jewish community. And I'm interested to see like if he keeps sticking his kind of commenting, and even if it's in a very subtle way, on the Israeli-Palestine conflict. I'm so sorry that I went over time, but we've got 7 minutes, so I am open to your questions. Alan.
I'm interested in, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Several things you said are really interesting, and I don't know if we have time to touch them. But two that really stuck out for me. One, you talked about the impact of France as a Catholic country, and I'm wondering if in the period from like Nostra Aetate in the 1870s till really 1943 in Divino Fonte Spiritu, when really biblical studies was kind of given the thumbs up by the papacy. I wonder if that critical set of decades, when in Germany, America, and England, there was so much archaeological and biblical scholarship going on, that didn't have a pretty big role in chilling out. But because I think we would have to say the same for Italy or other Catholic countries. It's just I think I would wonder if there's a lot of Protestant Catholic divide here. I guess the other question, and we'll talk about it at some other point,
talk about over lunch.
The whole idea of Romer as describing himself as an archaeologist of the text, I think that's a fascinating self-description, especially in light of his collaboration with Israel Finkelstein, who, if you ask, I think in the Israeli press over the last quarter century, you would describe Finkelstein as an archaeologist against the text more than of the text. So I'm answer either one.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll answer the latter because, yeah, I mean, I found, as I hadn't really done a lot of work on Finkelstein. He doesn't, my book ends in, 1950. And so, I just know the name, but I didn't kind of know uh, um, the dimensions of who he is, right? And kind of the controversies that he's raised by being a very good archaeologist, a very good, historian of the sort. Yeah, they seem to be simpatico. I think that's because Romer has this interesting, and I see that in Paro too, has, walks the line of being a believer. So he does, I read a bunch of interviews with him. He reads his Bible every day. He goes to his French Reform church, and yet he believes that the Hebrew Bible and the Bible as a text is an accretion of books written, and I think it seems really stimulated by finding out, along with Finkelstein, when the archaeological record actually disputes the textual record. And so, I found multiple, just from their excavation, multiple kinds of orthodoxies that they are excited to challenge. So, I mean, Romer seems to be, maybe for the same reasons that Finkelstein is pilloried in the press sometimes, Romer seems to be beloved in France by being willing, I think that's interesting, by being willing to say, I can both believe and I can historicize this text and find great, frisson, I can find great kind of enjoyment in the fact that they contradict each other. Yeah. Andy?
You mentioned that the French felt themselves to be late to the party at biblical archaeology in Palestine. Did French archaeologists have anything to do in, say, classical archaeology in Lebanon or in Syria? There's certainly a lot of, sites there like Biblos and Baalbek and so on. Did the French have anything to do with that?
Yes. I mean, the French, were took great pride in, going back to the earlier in the 19th century of having Jean-François Champollion, the decoder of the hieroglyphs from Egypt, really, kind of then considered themselves the premier country of Egyptology up until the 1880s when the British arrived. But likewise in classical archaeology, so ancient Greece and Rome, that was the focus of French archaeology in the 19th century, and so they get bested by the Germans in the latter kind of third of the 19th century because of money. But up until that point, they were trying to get excavations going at Baalbek, for example, sniffing around Palmyra in present day Syria, the French School of Athens and the French School of Rome, which were established in, I don't remember the date specifically, so I won't make them up, but early 19th century. I think that the French School of Athens is the first of the European centers that get established, at least in Athens. And they don't sound like they have a specific focus on archaeology, but everybody who went there in the 19th century was going to excavate. So I think that they primarily did see themselves as heirs of a classical tradition, which makes a certain amount of sense, given that the French Revolution happens in 1789, which is has secularizing impulses, and really validates or valorizes Rome and Greece. And so it's kind of not a surprise that in the 19th century, then those are the heritages that they pursue and try to be the leaders in. Alyssa.
Some of the ways you've described Romer make me think that he is perhaps self-consciously undoing or opposing Edward Said and Orientalism, and even Foucault, who Said drew from, with that return of the repressed. That's a direct Foucauldian quote, but he turns it on his head, and he's like, oh, the Bible is the return of the repressed.
Right.
How weird is that?
Yeah.
I get a sense, without him having said anything about his politics, that he's kind of got some nationalist. Clearly, you've said he's a practicing Christian, but I get the sense that he's got some conservative, possibly even nationalist, although he's not French, tendencies.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I work a lot on Said I have to for my book. I mean, I see a certain amount of he uses words like Western civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization, which I don't think Said would, I think he would, we know that he would be critical of the idea of using Western civilization as a construct. And I think same with, Judeo-Christian civilization, or at least he would be excavating the politics of that. So yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent there is this impulse in Romer to push back, to challenge that kind of dominance of, thought that is the case in France. I think, and I mean, Said has been so influential in general. I found some really interesting passages in an interview that he gave where, he said that he's not a postmodernist. Like, he believes that there are facts, that there are truths that you can find, that it's not, up to, not every story basically has, multiple interpretations. So I thought that was, pretty interesting and telling. And I think to a certain extent that might help explain his interest in archaeology, which of course any archaeologist would argue, like, that interpretation is everything, and that the facts on the ground are open to interpretation. But I think that Romer has a kind of desire to argue that there are facts, and that you can find them in the ground, and those are kind of irrefutable truths, which I think is something that Said would push back against. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm still just trying to kind of wrap my head around Romer. He's somebody who came on my radar. I mean, actually, he came on my radar in 2021 when a friend had that magazine, Science and Future, that had him and Finkelstein, and knew my research and said, you have to read this. So I was like, oh, who is this guy? He sounds interesting. But I'm having to write the epilogue for the book pretty soon, and I'm curious about bringing him in. And so I'm going to kind of be looking into him more to get a sense of his politics. It wouldn't surprise me if he is, politically, if he's is not like Zemmour. I mean, he's not a far right thinker, I don't think. I mean, I think he's pretty probably centrist politically, but in terms of intellectually or epistemologically, I think, yeah, he's trying to do a bit of revisionist work.
Well, I think we all know at least one of Professor Griswold's future book topics. Or essay topics. Let's, we've had verbal questions in class, a teaching class. Let's give Professor Sarah Griswold closing.
Thank you very much.